Across the Sun by Jason Pagano and Bill Robinson. Part 2, Chapter 17, No Place Like Home. When Clyde was younger, she'd often wake up in the middle of the night and hear soft chatter from somewhere in the house. It could have been her siblings talking among themselves, or Gorham and Saba discussing something downstairs but within earshot of the sliding pool. She'd been unable to tune into the chatter right away, at first. It had been only noise rousing her. She knew of no proper word for that moment, but she felt it now. All her siblings felt it now. At some point, the silence spell must have expired. Maybe the spell had stayed behind as they'd moved out of range. No one had told them they'd successfully reached their destination, nor did they want to do anything that might disrupt the process, so they continued breathing slowly with their eyes closed. When had they first heard noises? Aiden's breathing was shallow, but they could all hear it. Niwa was fidgeting, and they could hear her small movements. The siblings heard these things in the absence of other stimuli, and their anxiety kept them at full alert. Rukaryu made the first move. With his eyes closed, he extended his arms and felt around. They heard a small thump and then glass shattering. Niwa yelled as the rest gasped.
What was that?
Aiden, shaken from his troubles on the roof earlier, imagined one of Gorham's special plates had shattered. He opened his eyes. The room was dark. Rukaryu was carefully feeling around for another object. Touching something, he cast light on the object. A glass bottle filled with the dark liquid was suddenly illuminated, resembling a spooky lantern lit with deep earth tones. Everyone looked at the bottle, which must have been knocked off a shelf. There was no longer any smoke in the room. In fact, the smoke maker, the plinth, and the long lens were all missing. Strange shelves looked as though they'd been made from curved walking sticks. Each shelf, along with a few conventional shelves, held several bottles.
I think this is a wine cellar,
Rukaryu said.
And I think I just broke a bottle of wine.
Niwa looked around. This room was roughly the same size and shape as the camera obscura, but it was not the same. She had no words.
Rook, wait.
Aiden looked up, listening for invaders stomping around upstairs. He heard nothing. Rukaryu cast a simple burnish spell. A flutter of invisible arcane swipes collected the broken glass and spilled liquid into a neat pile the elf then directed into a small, galvanized pail.
It seemed like a responsible thing to do.
The mage had that look of benign mischief in his eyes, as though he wanted to run his finger over a cake and score a dab of frosting.
Where are Saba and Gorham?
Clyde, looking blankly ahead, seemed quite uneasy. As soon as his sister had asked, Aiden felt angry at himself for having failed to notice their absence.
They're not here.
Niwa squeaked.
They're not here.
Rukaryu reached for her hand, gently shushed her before she could finish the crescendo. He was scared, too, but didn't think they weren't completely alone down here. Everyone stopped and looked to the ceiling once more. They fixated so intensely in the quiet they could hear blood pumping in their ears. Clyde couldn't wait any longer. She dashed from the room. It wasn't lost on her that this spiral staircase was not the hewn ramp leading to the camera obscura. At the top of the stairs, she opened a door so quietly not even her siblings heard it.
Rook, I need to leave this with you.
Aiden set down the bag Saba had foisted on him, stuffing in it the paperwork he'd also carried. He also felt the need to scout out this place that wasn't home. Feeling panic and despair, Niwa attempted a recitation.
Leo Saifa of the Eastern Flats had found the lost child of House Chai.
She whispered, looking everywhere but focusing on nothing. The gnome kept whispering anything she could recall from her conversations with her ancestral clan. Curious, Rukaryu watched his sister, but did not interrupt. When her hands began to glow, her brother's eyes widened. She continued whispering.
Liu Nuye of the near bog saved the running hunter from the hidden water's edge.
A bottle of wine also began to glow. She moved towards it, uncorking the bottle and pouring the contents onto the hewn floor. The bottle continued to cast a warm glow as the puddle of burgundy wine glistened like a slick of oil. Niwa never stopped whispering and was now faintly smiling as she moved around the lighted bottle to play off the puddle's reflection.
Handmaiden Liu Trizo of the Autumn Bend caught the errant spear with otherworldly courage, and no child was harmed that harrowing day.
With the glow near her face and her constant talking, she appeared to be telling a campfire story to guests only she could see. The light reflecting off the wet floor began to ripple and bend. The dark liquid became even darker as the light coalesced. Ricardo stared in joyful disbelief. He'd had no idea his sister had this ability within her. The light solidified into a shape. From thin air, a crouching gnome woman stood. She was slightly taller than Niwa, with small braids gathered into a larger, loose braid at her shoulders. Just as Niwa, in disbelief, was about to drop the lit bottle, the woman casually took it from her, holding it aloft as if looking for sediment.
Think we could crack open another one, lass?
The woman noticed the puddle and stepped around it. Ricardo, speechless, looked to his sister about what to do next.
Are you really here?
Niwa asked, incredulous.
I haven't heard the Liu name spoken in a very long time.
The woman said.
Their clan left many generations ago. Restless wanderers, is that right?
Yes.
Niwa said, suddenly recalling something.
Oh, yes. They're from another world. I'm Liu Niwa, and I'm very pleased to make your acquaintance. And you said, I suppose. That means you suppose, not he or she like the others. Oh, this is so exciting.
Ricardo had no idea what his sister was saying. The woman chuckled.
Delightful one you are, Niwa. I'm Guanskoy. My clan never did venture very far. And who is this dashing fellow?
Ricardo flinched.
I'm Niwa's brother, Rook. Ricardo, that is. Happy to make your acquaintance.
He was twice the height of the woman flirting with him.
That's so. I've taken in my share of stray animals as well. The home is universal, isn't that right?
The woman seemed to realize how uncouth she sounded and tried to gloss things over with a pleasant grin.
We're all foster children,
Niwa explained, still too delighted to be put off.
Our other sister and brother went upstairs.
Oh,
Ricardo said.
we need to get upstairs, too.
He hadn't heard anything since they'd headed for the stairs. He grabbed the bag Aiden had left behind.
I have so many questions.
Niwa continued, practically vibrating from her excitement.
But Rook is right. Can you come with us, Skoy? They're never going to believe this.
Never say never.
Ricardo teased. The elf collected the glowing bottle from the woman.
I'm afraid we'll have to sneak upstairs. We may not be alone, and the light would blow our cover.
He set the bottle down on the floor, but left the light spell active on it.
Are we in danger?
The woman asked nonchalantly.
And what is this place we're sneaking around, love?
As she climbed the stairs, Niwa reached for the woman's hand and was shocked to feel it really there. This was the closest connection to her people she'd ever experienced, and it invigorated her. Ricardo let the gnomes ascend first. He looked at the wine cellar once more. He said,
It's probably home.
Chapter 18. Head Count. As they reached the top of the staircase, sunlight filled the hall. Niwa observed what at first glance looked like Gorham's study. The room was a mess of papers, many tacked haphazardly to the windowless walls. She felt uncomfortable, suspecting this room was off limits too. Ricardo politely squeezed by his sister so he could scrutinize the tacked-up documents. They had not yet seen their siblings. Nothing seemed to stir in the house. Niwa went down the hall toward the source of the daylight. The gnome woman followed but paused, noticing a screen door and a chicken coop beyond it. She opened the screen door and went into the warm afternoon sun. The door slammed shut with a familiar swatting sound. Aiden was sneaking up the stairs, interior to this house, when he looked down to see a woman walking through the kitchen below. She didn't notice him, but he was horrified and wished he weren't alone on this narrow staircase. He held his breath, now hearing footsteps coming from upstairs. They were slow, but very close. These stairs were also creaky like the ones at home, and he despaired at trying to retreat quietly.
Sheer, I thought we were meeting tomorrow.
A light-hearted voice called from above. The siblings all froze. A walking stick touched the top step. Then a sandaled foot followed by another. A young dwarf appeared, then paused to behold her unexpected guests.
I can't imagine how you got in here.
She said calmly. Continuing down the stairs one at a time with her ash walking stick, the dwarf looked vaguely like Saba, but younger and with a different style. Her baggy shirt featured colorful patchwork designs matching her headband, and her curly hair was done up, emerging above her forehead and brown eyes. Aiden awkwardly stood up from his crouching position.
Who are you?
He asked timidly. Her casual approach and voice made him drop the defensive stance. The dwarf grinned. She descended 2 steps to meet Aiden.
I'm Aubrey.
She noticed 2 others standing in her kitchen.
You're in my house. You mean to tell me you 3 got through the ward spells without even knowing who lived here? Pretty bold, I'll give you that.
What spells?
Rukaryu asked, feeling out of turn. He was just as surprised as his siblings to see a dwarf with cropped hair and wearing short pants, a billowing tunic, and sandals talking about magic. With bright eyes, she glanced at the elf before looking back at Aiden.
Take my cane, child,
She commanded. She let go, and he extended a hand to catch it, but his hand abruptly connected with an invisible barrier. Aiden felt he'd just palmed a stone wall very hard, and he recoiled in smarting pain. Aubrey did not react to the boy's reaction. The falling cane stopped and returned to the dwarf's hand as if tethered to an invisible string.
Why don't we chat at the table?
The dwarf invited the astonished siblings. Niwa, having followed everyone to the kitchen, tried not to blatantly stare at Aubrey, although her curiosity was equal parts trepidation and admiration. The house's layout was similar despite many cosmetic differences. In the dining room, the siblings waited for their host to sit first before joining her at the table, which was 2 places smaller than their own. As they sat, the kitchen door opened again.
You have a nice chicken coop. I've never seen Araucana fowl before, and they're just lovely. One of your hens has scaly leg mites. I'll get the vinegar.
The gnome woman began opening cabinets and rummaging.
You should join us.
The dwarf said.
I'm Aubrey, and who might you be? My eldritch heart. Are there any more of you running around my house?
I'm Niwa. It's a pleasure to meet you.
The younger gnome desperately tried to think what to say.
There are 6 of us. Oh, there are 7. But we thought the others were upstairs, perhaps with you.
She was convincing herself their parents were nearby.
No.
Rukaryu cleared his throat.
I mean, I think something went wrong with the spell. Gorham and Saba are...
He stopped himself, then looked at Aubrey, who eyed him curiously.
Oh, I'm Rukaryu. Please pardon our trespassing. I assure you we've no intention of interloping on your business.
What do you mean something went wrong?
Niwa looked down at the tabletop. Her hands were shaking. Aiden introduced himself.
I didn't mean to alarm you up there. We heard footsteps and thought you might be our parents.
He was not about to allow this spellcasting woman to harm his family.
My head is spinning.
Aubrey placed a hand on her forehead and briefly closed her eyes.
There is no one else upstairs. Now, who are you, madam?
The gnome woman was moving aside bottles and jars, searching for vinegar. She paused to scrutinize the label on a small bottle.
What's jojoba? It smells nutty. Can I use this?
She set the bottle down and kept searching, not realizing Aubrey was talking to her. Aubrey cleared her throat loudly to no avail.
Oh, almonds.
The gnome withdrew her head from the cabinet, holding a small pouch.
It's been ages, but almonds were always my favorite.
Her words ended abruptly as she blinked out of existence. The pouch fell, and a few almonds bounced out.
What the?
Aiden exclaimed. Everyone else looked surprised.
Who has been summoning in my house?
Aubrey waited for an answer. The boys looked alarmed, and Niwa started to hyperventilate. Rukaryu reached an arm around his sister's shoulders.
We are so sorry about this.
This isn't happening. There aren't really children summoning in my house.
Aubrey sounded agitated, then paused.
I want to ask some questions and figure out what's going on here. Where do I even start?
We're real.
Aiden hoped this was helpful.
Well, I guess that woman wasn't. Our home was about to be destroyed, and our father sent us across the sun to save us. We thought he and Miss Saba came with us, but I fear we lost them.
Mother.
Niwa interjected breathlessly. Obery studied the gnome to make sure she wasn't about to pass out.
Your father? Who is that exactly?
His name is Gorham.
Rukaryu answered. He thought to say more, but they had no support network here, and information brought to the wrong people could prove disastrous. In fact, he began mentally willing his siblings not to speak so readily.
So those 2 plus you 3 makes 5. Even if you were counting that summoned gnome woman, for which I'd still like an explanation, by the way, that makes 6. Who is this 7th person?
Niwa was almost sobbing, and her nerves were shot. Rukaryu held her and stroked her hair. He wanted to be honest without revealing Clyde. Her cover would soon be blown wherever she was.
Clyde, are you in here?
Aiden asked, his voice raised.
Our other sister is with us.
Like a ghost, Clyde appeared just beyond the screen door. She looked stricken with grief, something her siblings had rarely ever seen.
Impossible.
Obery said, seeing the young Tikus. Excited, she struggled to rise from her chair and grab her walking stick.
Stay back.
Clyde warned through shallow breaths. Her tail moved toward the dagger hidden behind her back. The dwarf flinched and stood beside the table.
How did you all get inside my house?
None of the siblings felt confident or willing, even, to answer. Niwa stood and approached Clyde as everyone watched.
There's some sort of barrier.
Clyde said.
It's invisible, but the breeze from the northeast stopped when I walked beyond the coop.
Amazing.
Obery muttered. She studied the Tikus.
I live out here alone, and I need to protect myself. You mean to tell me you didn't know about my defenses, and yet you're all inside my house, right under my nose, and not a single ward was tripped? I demand an explanation.
Rukaryu deflected.
Gorham and Saba are also dwarves, as well as magic users. Do you know them?
Travelers from across the sun? No, I don't suppose I do,
replied Obery. Aiden was watching Obery's face. Her eyes were lowered and she'd turned quite pale. He stood, ready to catch her if she fainted. The dwarf sat down again, resting her head in her hand.
How did you get in? I can't have you leaving some magic door open for anyone to come through. I've worked too hard and sacrificed too much to fail now.
Gorham cast the spell. He built something called a camera obscura, which brought us directly to your wine cellar.
A loud noise made Rukaryu suddenly jump out of his seat. Obery had pounded the table.
It can't be. You children have to be out of your minds.
The siblings all watched with alarm.
Miss Obery, are you all right?
Aiden leaned forward and his forehead met with an invisible barrier that nearly caused him to fall backwards. Her eyes were closed and she moaned faintly. Rukaryu studied their host.
I think she's anemic. Can I help you to your bed?
Obery didn't raise her head.
I can take care of myself. Always have. Please leave me. I have much too much to think about now.
She reached for her walking stick but struggled to rise. Aiden tried to meet her eyes.
I'm worried about your bad knee. Please don't go back up those stairs when you're feeling faint. I can help you with your knee pain. I can heal.
Obery looked at Aiden. She stared hard at him, causing him to lose his nerve.
Did you say heal? You can heal?
The dwarf closed her eyes. She murmured,
Get out.
Rukaryu felt himself being pushed back. He stumbled, then regained footing as an invisible barrier was expanding outwards. Aiden and Niwa felt this bubble slowly pushing them back as well. They retreated, slowly, while anxiously watching Obery, who now looked asleep in her chair.
We need to leave,
Clyde said.
There's an opening through the woods past the chicken coop where the barrier ends. I'll show you.
The siblings retreated to the backyard, which looked completely different than they'd expected. It was surreal. There were no stairs and no door leading to their dormitory. Instead, there was a solid wall. Clyde dropped to her knees, then collapsed onto the wooded ground beyond Obery's yard. Her gray fur stood on end as she convulsed with choked breaths.
They left us.
The Tikus cried. She had never realized how much she depended on some things always remaining the same. This fear was worse than any phantom Gorham had ever pitted her against. She knew at least the phantoms had never been real. Rukaryu wished he knew how to console his sister. He collapsed onto the moss. He only thought about his breath. He wished the rain would fall on him. Aiden and Niwa also dropped to the moss and decided, for the moment, to just let themselves be. They were in the woods, and they were alone. Chapter 19. Out of the Bag. In the late afternoon, Aiden awoke to a bristling sensation. He was lying on his back, and a woolly bear caterpillar was crawling along his forehead. After he got his bearings, he plucked the little traveler off him and tossed it toward a tree. He sat up and saw his sibling sleeping on the ground. Suddenly, he remembered the woman in red. He struggled to see her clearly, but vividly saw smoke billowing over him and his comrades, who were slain and covered in blood. He shook his head in distress and glanced at his siblings, who appeared fine.
Rook.
Aiden remembered his brother wasn't sleeping, just lying motionless with his eyes closed.
I'm glad you're awake.
Rikaru sat up.
I wanted to let everyone rest, but I have to say, I just had the most transcendent experience. It was...
He sighed blissfully.
We need to figure out shelter before nightfall.
Aiden was only half listening. His own vision had upset him.
I can't believe I left us so vulnerable out here.
There's no fault required.
Rikaru reached over and gently shook his sisters awake.
Oh, I just remembered. There should be food in there.
Aiden gestured to the bag he'd left with his brother.
Anyone else hungry?
The elf furrowed his brow when he opened the bag. He gathered a mess of stray paperwork shoved on top and sorted it into a neat pile, noticing Gorham's handwriting.
Allow me.
Niwa said sarcastically as she reached around her brother, now reading the papers, to scoop up the bag. She retrieved a bag of almonds first, briefly wondering if all dwarf women kept bags of almonds. She sighed.
Why did that nobleman disappear like that?
It would be nice to eat as a family, maybe pass the food around a little.
Aiden said playfully.
Clyde and I are famished.
He wished he knew if Clyde understood his joke. She was staring at him and saying nothing. Aiden handed her a red apple and some homemade granola.
Niwa, who was that woman?
Aiden took an apple for himself and passed some dried meat to her, knowing they were the only two who'd eat it. He thought to advise eating perishable items first, but realized the hypocrisy as he held jerky.
She appeared when I was praying to my ancestors. I pray when I'm scared. It calms me down. You and Clyde had already gone upstairs to investigate, now that I think of it. But Rook saw it happen too.
Niwa accepted the jerky. She'd never lie to her family, but only her sister knew about the ancestors with whom she chatted when alone. She'd been embarrassed to mention it, but things were different now.
The ancestors.
Clyde looked to her sister, trying to decide if this could be true. This had been the first time she'd ever seen or heard one of these mysterious people for herself.
I believe,
Rikaru said,
you developed a method of arcane summoning. I've heard of summon spells before, but have never seen one. Did Gorham teach you how to do that?
He doesn't know about it.
Niwa replied sheepishly.
But this has never happened before, honest. I mean, yes, I talk with my ancestors sometimes, but they're only images before me. Something has changed. She was real. You all saw her.
Talk with ancestors? A minute ago, you said you prayed to them.
Aiden said.
Which is it? Professor Gorham once gave me quite an earful when I talked about prayer or healing or anything like that. Even if I do pray, my prayer doesn't make people appear and disappear.
Aiden, hang on.
Rikaru looked to his sister.
I believe prayer, in this case, simply means talking to spirits. The gnome woman was real enough, but she appeared in concordance with a summon spell. I was there when it happened, and we all saw it end. This ability behaves like arcana. Frankly, I'm excited Niwa found this ability within herself.
Niwa sighed, then smiled. She felt the burden of her secret float away. The siblings continued eating as the sun began to set through the trees. From his rucksack, Aiden retrieved the short sword, the same sword he'd removed from the hobgoblin. The encounter already felt as if it had occurred ages ago.
Rook, can you put light on this for me? We should probably figure out where to go next.
Rikaru recognized the short sword.
I'm glad at least that episode is behind us.
He illuminated the worn sword with arcana. Then he stowed Gorham's paperwork in his pack, eager to study it more in the daylight.
Perhaps Raven's Cross is still nearby,
Clyde suggested. She was already standing, holding a dagger and ready to travel. It was as though she were always prepared and quietly on standby in the company of others.
Oh, now I miss Skunk too.
Niwa felt left out not carrying a weapon. She'd keep an eye out for a good walking stick.
Think you remember the way?
Rikaru grinned at Clyde, who'd guided them there just a few days ago. She looked to the northeast, but didn't appear confident. She looked to Aiden. The oldest sibling held forward his illuminated sword, took a deep breath, and began walking.
I'm praying we can figure something out.
Chapter 20. The Roadhouse. No one wanted to admit they hadn't found a road or path after traveling for 2 hours. Oddly, time didn't seem to drag as they scrutinized all sorts of trees and natural landmarks, trying to remember them. Niwa had not yet found a suitable walking stick. Her brother's short sword was still illuminated, but she'd been amusing herself with disposable light sources. She'd elected to cast her tried-and-true Create Flame spell instead of the conventional light spell so she could wield a burning stick. Not sure how to make a proper torch, she let small fires consume a branch in minutes, only to discard the burnt end with a tisk and smother it underfoot.
Up there on the left.
Clyde pointed to something far into the darkness. Her siblings couldn't see anything, but soon they were walking over some tamped-down earth that might have long ago served as a trail.
I don't remember any area that looked like this.
Rikaru sighed.
But then again, why would I? I feel like everything we know is wrong.
Everything's going to be fine.
Aiden replied slightly reproachfully. He felt in his core his words were true, and even if they weren't, they needed to be said. The siblings tried to pick up the trail, but it wasn't easy. As they navigated the side of a hillock, they discovered a platform abutting the foot of a slope. Aiden held out his sword and saw this broken platform was once a floor. This site was a building that had been totally destroyed. Only the floor and parts of a few beams remained.
Do you think someone lived here?
For an instant, Aiden saw this building and the road running past it as a metaphor for their journey. He shrugged off his inner pessimism.
This was a roadhouse.
Clyde was glancing behind them, considering where the road might have gone. Her Tica's nose picked up the smell of something decaying. She looked back to the building and further up the slope.
Oh,
Rikaru perked up.
There was a roadhouse in one of my books. Clyde, are you sure? Wow, I was just reading that on our last trip.
To Ravenscross?
Aiden caught his brother's eye.
Shining swords?
No.
Rikaru chuckled.
That was the book you mentioned, but it doesn't actually exist. I was reading Thief in the Night, and one of the places that pops up regularly in it is a place called the Wayward Grange. It isn't a barn, but rather a roadhouse where all sorts of delinquency and debauchery went down. Lots of fights.
So, a building out of reach of the law where people fight.
Aiden thought of the 3 wayward men he'd encountered at Ravenscross, rubbing his shoulder as he remembered the pain.
Want to go take a look?
Asked Niwa eagerly. She was holding another branch, ready to light a new torch.
It was probably just a watering hole,
Rikaru said, responding to Aiden.
I'd say this is a good omen, that it indicates we're finding our way back to civilization. But then again...
Aiden nodded at his brother's inference. Deciding to check out the ruined roadhouse, he studied 3 destroyed stairs in a heap of rubble. His siblings followed behind him, as he'd expected. Niwa's new torch caught some dead leaves on its branch and flared up quickly, startling her. After the flame returned to a steady glow, a loud thumping noise came from the ruins. Seconds later, a figure attempted to rise from some debris using only legs. Failing to stand, it crashed to the floor with a painful-sounding thump. Aiden, gripping his short sword, began to climb up what remained of the stairs. Clyde had followed behind him, but then dashed around the perimeter and into the shadows. On its second upward lurch, the figure stood upright rather quickly. A sickly human just within Aiden's light. His flesh looked raw, and his clothes were tatters clinging to his frame. His uncoordinated, one-armed body suddenly lunged forward with an incredible speed. With sunken eyes, the man fixated on Niwa as he leapt off the platform. Aiden gasped in surprise and stopped hoisting himself up, dropping into a tumble to make chase. Clyde also turned around and came sprinting back to her sister's aid. Rikaru dropped the bag with their food and began casting a spell. Niwa was a good distance away from the roadhouse, but the man cleared the gap, collapsing into a curled shape right in front of her. The gnome was shocked to see this dreadful creature before her. Despite his gaunt frame, he had a large, distended stomach that nearly touched the ground. His head was down, and under his matted hair she could see sores on his rotten skin and a deep gash covered in dried blood. All at once, the man uncurled and lunged at Niwa, his palm open. The spring attack hit her with incredible force just below the shoulder. The sound of breaking bones came from her clavicle, but also from the man's hand. Her assailant didn't react to his gnarled fingers folded backwards, now dangling like sausage links held together by casing. The blow knocked Niwa flat on her back, taking her wind away and causing her to drop the burning branch. Her chest burned as she tried to cough, and she nearly choked as her first gasps reclaimed her airway. With some arcane words, Rickaryu pressed his hand forward, directing a torrent spell at their agile foe. A hydraulic push of water shot forward like a cannonball. But after his springing attack, the man stood and reeled back as if to exaggerate a deep breath, and he projectile vomited at the branch's embers. An extraordinary flow of vomit poured from his big belly and his desiccated mouth, hitting the branch and his victim. The torrent of water passed just ahead of the man, intercepting most of his retching, the mixture splashing in a mess to the side. Rickaryu had intended to blast the man away from his sister, but at least he'd inadvertently spared her this disgusting insult to injury. Some vomit still hit the embers, which burst into a fireball. This sudden explosion only grazed Niwa, but nearly caught Aiden as he advanced into the melee. With his sword still illuminated, Aiden tackled the man instead of running him through. As the man collapsed, he projectile vomited once more, covering Aiden's midsection. Seizing the opportunity with their opponent down, Clyde pounced, sending her dagger through his chest until it hit ground beneath him. The man attempted to clutch at the dagger, failing with his broken fingers. His dark marbled eyes sunk further into his skull as he started thrashing. As if barely injured, he struck Clyde hard in the gut. The Tikas choked as her small body was knocked back. She tightened her abdominal muscles and thrust her dagger down again, carving open the man's throat. This time, the man was slow to react, though he squirmed on the ground as Clyde tumbled away from him. Aiden wasn't taking any chances with this man, who refused to die. He stepped on his punctured chest and hacked off the man's lone arm, startled when it simply tore away like hacking stalks of wheat. With a foot on the man's chest, he pinned him down in case of more surprises. The man ceased moving.
There may be more.
Clyde strained a bit from abdominal pain as she got to her feet, retrieving her dagger and scanning the area for movement. Rickaryu rushed to Niwa's side. Her breathing was shallow and her eyes were clenched shut. She might be sparing herself from seeing the carnage and vomit. He gently slid his arms under her and carried her away.
This isn't...
Niwa muttered between sniffs and coughing. Rickaryu heard her, but focused on getting farther away from another possible ambush. It was the middle of the night, and no place around them felt safe. Aiden trailed behind, guarding their retreat while watching the roadhouse. He desperately wanted to locate Clyde, who had vanished into the night. He shook off visions of craven men ambushing her. The idea that he could fail to protect everyone nauseated him.
I can't be helpless anymore.
Niwa sobbed quietly.
I can't do this. I'm going to get us all killed.
Such despair shocked her brother. He settled with her in a mossy area among dirt and rocks.
You're never helpless, and we couldn't have gotten this far without you.
Rickaryu reassured her.
I'm scared too. I could only think that my spell would get him away from you, and that would be enough. But it wasn't. You were lying there, and that monster was... I couldn't move. Thankfully, Aiden and Clyde were brave. I was pathetic.
No one is pathetic. That's enough.
Aiden said as he joined his siblings. Rickaryu felt ashamed. His brother was still covered in vomit and smelled terrible.
Aiden, hold still a moment, would you?
The mage spoke a few words and began to move his arms. Niwa heard his incantation, and her eyes widened as she realized the spell he was casting.
Look, wait!
Niwa instinctively reached her arm out, forgetting about her broken shoulder, causing her to shriek in pain. She rolled onto her other side. Rickaryu thrust his arms forward at his brother, and a blast of pressurized mist erupted from his hands. His scald spell washed over Aiden with a cool and refreshing mist. Most of the slick vomit was blasted to the dirt. The brothers were horrified to see Niwa injure herself. Rickaryu had considered that smelling vomit might traumatize their sister again if Aiden had come any closer, but this painful reaction was much worse. Aiden dropped his sword and crouched to place his hand on Niwa's shoulder.
I didn't mean for this to happen.
Rickaryu felt scared and guilty. He stood and looked toward the roadhouse, unsure how to help her.
Will you be all right? I need to find Clyde, and we all need to get out of here.
Yes, I'll need a few minutes.
Aiden said as gray flames emanated from his healing hands. Rickaryu shrugged, deciding not to cast light once more, as his original spell would expire on Aiden's sword. By the faint light of the cloudy moon, he jogged back. Despite his adrenaline, he was exhausted. He thought he saw figures moving on the hill beyond the roadhouse. His sister was out there alone, and he was weak and running back into the fray. He felt overwrought.
Rook,
Said a small voice. Now he felt delusional. Clyde jogged up alongside her brother. Rickaryu snapped out of his echo chamber of guilt and doubt, halting in his tracks.
You're all right!
Rickaryu said, then flinched at his own loudness.
that building has a mostly intact cellar.
Clyde responded.
No one else is around.
Her ability to navigate the darkness so skillfully astonished him, but should they take shelter where they'd just been attacked? His wary mind finally understood his siblings were now all safe. He let out a slight laugh, then started to weep involuntarily. Clyde returned with Aiden and Niwa, allowing her sister with a mostly healed shoulder to hug her. The defunct roadhouse's ground floor was surprisingly intact. As Clyde had said, a trapdoor secured a cellar beneath the floorboards. Aiden grinned when he noticed the rusted padlock and chains pushed off to the side, then looked at his sister. He gave one final glance across the grounds, then followed his siblings downstairs, closing the door above him. There were little more than tipped and smashed kegs down below. Rokario suspected this had been a stockroom. Pushing some wreckage aside, Niwa never thought she'd be so happy to feel cool earth beneath her. Within moments, the gnome was fast asleep on the ground. Rokario expired his light spell, and the room became dark. Outside was a man they'd just slaughtered in self-defense. Like finding their parents, this would be an important matter to discuss, but not now. Aiden wasn't sure if his siblings had fallen asleep or fallen into a meditative trance, but he allowed himself to relinquish night watch duty, convincing himself everything would be all right tomorrow. On the next episode, the siblings are attacked just hours after finding themselves in this strange new world. After killing a man in self-defense, Clyde meets someone while scouting the area for more danger.
You don't say much, do you, Clyde?
A new face, but strangely familiar.
When I was younger, I never bothered talking much either. People took one look at me and already knew what they wanted to know. There wasn't much point in proving them wrong.
Hunkering down in the only shelter they can find, Niwa resolves to be stronger for the sake of her family.
I didn't succeed all my people to fail now.
After focusing her magic, she summons a friendly guide with some insight about their new surroundings who helps to show them the way onward.
The nearest town is beyond this hill here. Follow the ridge to the northeast. Silk Rhode is built into the mountain's base, but it's no place for young ones.
Chapter 21, Being Seen. Next time on Across the Sun. Across the Sun Episode 4 was voiced by Danielle Bouchard as Clyde, Julia Boudreau as Niwa, Bill Robinson as Aiden, Jason Pagano as Rokario, Alicia Robinson as Aubrey, and Patricia Cousineau as Skoy. Narrated by, edited, scored, mixed, and mastered by Thomas Wells. Some sound effects and music acquired from Zapsplat.com.